Next, we're going to take a little out of order, if my colleagues don't object here, and move to addendum item A1. And this is the election day and emergency voting plans. And I would like to welcome up our Maricopa County Recorder, Adrian Fontes, who's joined us, as well as our two directors, our director who reports to the Board of Supervisors for election day and emergency voting, Scott Jarrett, and then also the director for the voter registration and early voting, Mr. Ray Valenzuela. Good morning, Mr. Recorder.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and members of the board, and ladies and gentlemen of the public. This is a very big day. I do want to mention, and if you want to catch me on this later, last evening I had a wonderful little appetizer made of some eggs from a local small family farm that I really enjoyed a lot. So if anybody, I actually did. That's not a joke. It was delicious. But
Flattery gets you everywhere.
Everywhere. That's great. Well, there's more to come, Mr. Chairman and members, because we're in an historic moment. And it's because we've decided to do what folks don't expect politicians to do. We've acted in a bipartisan manner. We've worked hard together. We've decided that change needed to happen, and here we are. This Democrat and a majority Republican board making things better for the folks because that's what they want, and we're dedicated to serve. I particularly want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the last year. You and I have met 12.5 times at least. Sometimes one-on-one, sometimes with staff, sometimes with other members of the board, and I've grown quite fond of those meetings. So whether or not you get reelected to that seat, I'd like to continue the relationship because you've been willing to listen, and I've listened as well, and I've learned a great deal from that interaction. So thank you very much for that. Again, it's historic. We've managed to do something that I think folks didn't expect us to do. And I think there were folks out there who wanted a lot more rancor, and they wanted a lot more of the political sport that other people are willing to give them. And here in Maricopa County, we've decided that we're going to take the high road. We're going to be mature and thoughtful, have data-driven, informed decision-making that's going to serve our people better. You've given us the resources that we've needed, not to mention a new co-director, a lot of new folks in our staff, some great new technology. We've improved our security, and we've done a lot to make elections administration better in Maricopa County. So now the board and the recorder's office, through the elections department and our co-chairs, our co-directors, are going to be doing some great things. I've approved the early voting plan that is within the purview of our part of things. Today I'm very hopeful that, as you'll see, the conjunctive work between these two co-directors that I'll introduce in a moment, I'm here to just ask you to approve that because, as your staff has seen, and I hope you've already had a chance to review, it's a heck of a piece of work. And particularly, Mr. Chair, for Supervisor Chukri, you've mentioned a couple of times that you wanted us to be best in class. Well, I've been known to be bold, so I'll be consistent in that. I think we're pretty darn close. We're pretty darn close if we're not there, and that's because of the folks that you've let us have and the resources we've been able to use. So to begin with, I want to, Scott Jarrett, who you all know, who you all have appointed to be the director, co-director for Election Day and emergency voting, will be following our co-director for early voting, Ray Valenzuela, who really needs no introduction, but for folks that don't know him, he started here at the wee age of, I think he was 4, when he started working in the election department, actually at 17, I think. His first summer job in college was with the Maricopa County Elections Department. So he's been able to help move this thing forward, teaching me and a lot of other folks what's been going on. He'll be, for your information, talking a bit about the early voting plan that we've already approved. And then, of course, you get to approve the Election Day and emergency voting plan. I encourage you to make that approval and to begin in a very robust way the activities that we are all ready to engage in. Again, I reiterate my thanks, not just to you, Mr. Chairman, but to the rest of the members for this bipartisan and cooperative effort to really improve the electoral administration circumstances here in Maricopa County so that we can get to that best-in-class goal that we've been looking forward to. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you, Mr. Fontes. Really appreciate the comments, and I would also let you know that I greatly appreciate the spirit of cooperation that you've operated within in the last year. I've enjoyed the opportunity to work together, and I want to say, you know, we spend a lot of time with Mr. Jarrett now as our Director of Election Day Operations, and he has had nothing but great things to say about everyone in the Recorder's Office, the professionalism, the incredible team that he now has the opportunity to work alongside with. So again, so thank you very much, Mr. Fontes. And with that then, I think we'll have Mr. Valenzuela, if you'd like to present to us on the early voting plan.
If I may, Mr.
Yeah,
Chair,
please.
and members of the board, I will be presenting the election day plan to you for your approval, and Ray will be presenting the early voting plan, but I just wanted to spend a few minutes. These plans.
I think, Scott, is your mic on?
Is that better?
There we go. Yes.
So I just wanted to express that these plans are our approach in the elections department to making sure that we have accessible, reliable, transparent, secure elections, especially for the March presidential preference election. And transparent being a key word here, that we're producing these plans 90 days in advance of the election. We look at these plans as not only the elections department plans, but the plans for the voters. So they can look at these plans and be prepared for the upcoming March election. And I also wanted to highlight this slide represents the structure of the elections operation agreement as agreed to by the board and the recorder back in October. And the components and the functional areas that are shown here on the plan are really what drove what was determined to be put in each one of these plans, whether it went in the early voting plan or the election day plan. So with that, I will turn it over to Ray to present the early voting plan.
Thank you, Mr. Jarrett. Good morning, Mr. Valenzuela.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the board. Before I even start, and I know we want to present this at a high level because there is two plans that have quite a bit of detail, so we're just going to skim through this. But I do want to emphasize that these, although they are separate plans, they were not created separately. This is in conjunction, collaboratively, that we, as the slide there shows, we have shared resources. And that was intended and intentional. So again, these plans are collaboratively created, albeit separate. They are ideal to work together. So on the early voting plan, I'll present this at as high level because I know you're here to approve the election day, but to give you that concept of where we're at, you'll see the early voting plan in detail includes stuff such as the voter registration part of the election, early voting, and the next slide will speak a little bit to that. Voter registration, the two top things, and voter registration clerk, what that is, and again, giving us some resources. We looked at all of these decisions with regards to not only election day, but early voting sites, line management. Some of those things is looking at different positions, adding more folks, and I know co-director Jared here will share about a line management position, but we've also added a voter registration clerk to the position, which bridges the gap between in our elections agreement where the recorder's still in charge of the voter registration, security, and sanctity of that. We're going to add that voter registration clerk to the position so we can continue to provide best-in-class services, not only during early voting, but on election day. So again, it's just a new position that's going to help us process folks, and the plan describes that in more detail. Communication and community outreach. There is a recorder's comm team and elections comm team by title only, but the recorder's comm team to some degree will focus on voter registration, will focus on early voting, and Scott will, or co-director Jared will speak to, that's how friendly we are, just call him Scott. Yeah. But we'll speak to the comms team on that. But the other thing I want to emphasize is this is collaborative. There is shared resources on these output of the communications plan because the voters only know that as the elections department, so that the plans will outline that this is still collaborative. Risk management, contingency planning. Again, the plan does speak to specific early voting for early voting sites. It outlines what we're going to do for absences at a vote center for early voting, but it is in conjunction with the election day plan. Voter registration eligible voters. The only thing I want to point out, and again, keep this at a high level, is the voter registration deadline is important to us. because the upcoming presidential preference is, and we will speak to the fact that it is a Democrat-only presidential preference election. There is an heir apparent for the parties, and the Libertarians have opted to not participate or have their own. So one of the things we're going to drive home, and when we get to the communications portion about this being a Democratic-only presidential preference, but here are some numbers, but the key thing is the registration deadline, February 18th. It actually, that's 28 days prior. The normal statutory thing is 29 days. They moved it back because on Monday, the normal 29 days is President's Day, holiday. How apropos that we are then giving an extra day to the voters to register. But it's important when we do start communicating, and we'll talk about a Be Ballot Ready platform, that we are focusing voters to say, if you want to participate, it's a Democrat only, and you have until February 18th. These are some numbers up here, and you'll see in the chart. The one thing to point out is that 712, this was as of November 1st, 712 actively registered Democrats. And one of the things from the early voting standpoint is looking at the permanent early voting PEVL, or Pebble if you're down south. But interchangeable, the PEVL total is how many ballots we're going to mail out automatically. We currently have, of that 712, approximately 562,000 of those Democrats that will be sent to ballot automatically. So there's some good things about that because it helps us make that line management decision when we get to early voting. And we're continuing to see some voter registration increases. We're just, as of this slide, I was just talking to Co-Director Jarrett here, that we raised 3,000 more registered Democrats within a month. So we are projecting a higher registration, but know that we are planning for a higher turnout. So we are looking at a 90% turnout rate for early voting, where in the past it's averaged about 80 to 85. For forecasting, we use 90. So we're there. We'd love to get it to 100, but that's not practical. But again, high enough to where we can plan accordingly.
Mr. Valenzuela, excuse me, Supervisor Hickman has a question.
So,
Yeah.
just real quickly, I saw that on the screen, and would you know that are they changing their registration from those 3,000? Is there a high percentage that are leaving independent and going to Democrat, or are these totally new voters? Would you have that information?
These were an increase, so they would be new voters. So they would be, so there's obviously that ebb and flow where you'll have some independent, but then it wouldn't adjust the numbers. It would just stay at that. So these are new voters that have come into the system. And then that increase has been seen, all tides rise, tide rise all boats. That's been seen also in the Republican, Libertarian. It's just that since we're focusing, we're pointing out that. The calendar, it is what it is. The only thing I want to point out is, December 9th, the candidates for the president's preference already have filed. There are 18 total. Secretary of State actually today at this moment is doing the draw for those 18 candidates. And the draw, by that I mean, is in this election, the order on the ballot is not determined, by rotation. It's drawn by lot. So there are 18 candidates that at the Civic Historic Center, I think, are being drawn now. The rest, again, speaks for itself, why we're here today to approve that. The only other point that I want, and this, again, is for the public to see, is point out the military and overseas voter date, February 1. That is really the date that elections begin. A lot of people say, well, March 17th. No, 45 days out, we have to have our first ballot ready for those military and overseas citizens. And again, I always emphasize, if anybody deserves a right to vote, those military voters, we want to make sure, and that's the date that we start our clock working backwards from. So it's an important date. And then, of course, carrying on to different dates as far as Election Day itself. One other thing is we do have a new law that requires ID for early voting. So in addition to that, that has already been put in place through our site book or e-poll books, if people are familiar with that e-poll book term. So it will require, just like Election Day, we will be doing ID at the or ID during early voting. We have 40 vote centers, and I want to emphasize these 40 vote centers because what that is, and we are trying to brand this for every countywide election. We will have 40 vote centers plus whatever amount of polling places is needed. In this, we have some consolidation that Co-Director Jarrett will speak to, but we will not remove or move backwards from that 40 vote center because they are our critical vote anywhere sites. They
Mr.
allow the voter, and if we can establish them in perpetuity, everybody will know, and we'll be able to, again, brand that every voter has 41 locations to vote at.
Mr.
40
Bounds.
vote anywhere, or the one assigned.
Sorry to interrupt you there, but Supervisor Chukri has a question.
Morning, Ray. Forgive me, I'm under the weather. Forgive my voice. Regarding the ID, I know there was some confusion that we spoke about with Scott. Is that a picture ID? Is it? I just want to make sure that we've come around to saying that has to be a picture ID, like a driver's license, not necessarily my voter ID card. I know some of my constituents had questions regarding that. Yeah.
Chairman, Supervisor Chukri, it is following statutory-driven ID at the poll requirements, which means that it's not specifically only voter ID or picture ID. There is 3 different mix and match. So you can provide a photo ID, and we do have statistics that show that probably 90% to 95% of the voters, that's their method of providing. However, the law does allow for a mix and match, a U.S. passport that doesn't happen to have the ID or driver or resident address, and then a utility bill. So there are mix and match, and it is outlined in statute, and we will put that out. It is out on our website, the elections website. So it is a mix and match as followed by statute.
Okay, and then one last question, Ray, as it relates to the voting centers. I know in earnest, we kind of did that last go around, and they performed relatively well. I know there's been some concern back and forth about should we have polling, go to all voting centers versus polling places, and I think we're getting to that right balance, especially as we evolve, as we spoke with Mr. Fontes last year about we do need to make sure elections is evolving, and I believe we certainly are. Are there any subtle changes that we've learned from the 18 election that we're going to employ as it relates to voting centers come 2020?
Chairman, Supervisor Chukri, absolutely. That is part of the learning process, our postmortem to any election, and that's the benefit and the beauty of the 40 vote centers is that we continue to improve them. We continue to improve our technology. We even gotten to a point of where the some of the issues with the ballot on demand, if they existed in 1 or 2 places, have been cured, locked down, and every election we make that much better. And even being able to, again, identify these 40 vote centers in perpetuity to lock them down helps us be able to create resources at those sites, such as hubs that are very close by those, so that if something technologically needs to be advanced, that we can move to that within minutes. So we definitely are using lessons learned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ray.
Thank you.
And again, I don't want to take too much time, so it is posted up there, the 9 vote centers. When we are opening 9 at the 27-day start, February 19th, we are then transitioning to opening them all March 9th to the 13th, and that's using data-driven decisions, once again, that we opened them all up at 27 days before, and there was 200 voters that showed up on the first day. So we are looking to make sure we're utilizing our resources and having them impact the process when we know voters tend to come to these locations. Last but not least, they're transitioning to emergency. These 40, or a portion of them will be transitioning on March 14th, which is a Saturday, and then Monday, the Monday prior, and then Election Day, they'll transition fully to Election Day sites. So it in complement with the assigned polling locations that Co-Director Jarrett will speak to. I'm going to skip over the uniformed overseas citizens because I spoke to it a little bit already, and that is outlined in our plan. The one I didn't is special election boards, which is part of statute, and that's for our individuals that are incapacitated, are at nursing homes, veterans homes. Once again, individuals that have served but may have a physical disability that prevents them from going on election day. That is outlined in our plan. Last but not least, and this ties to both, and it's a good transition for Co-Director Jarrett, is our BeBallotReady.vote. We have, that is a project or a outreach that we're doing, and part of that is to create a personalized dashboard that is going to be specific to a voter. A voter goes in, logs in, they give us their information, they get everything they need to see instead of searching through several links. By name and address, we can give you your sample ballot, we can give you all the information as far as your representatives, everything. So again, it is a process by which we've committed to create this easy, centralized point for voters of Maricopa County to come to. And the only thing I'll mention is that it is going to open in phases. Right now, it'll focus on generic information once it launches. It's not going to be too specific, but that'll be phase 0, as you call it. And we do have, and I'm mentioning a mascot that is potentially invented, but we'll be launching out. Phase 1 is voter registration focus, and speak to that it's a Democratic presidential preference. And that happens around January 20th through the February 23rd, phase 2. Focus on early voting. It's February 24th through March 9th. When early voting going on, we switch the messaging on that to be mail ballot deadlines, election dates. And then phase 3 is March 10th, March 17th, early voting's over. It's more election day related, then we'll switch to focus on election day, in addition to drop-off locations for ballots or in-person voting information. So that's the B ballot ready, and I'll, from here then, transition and switch over to Co-Director Jarrett here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Valenzuela. Appreciate all your work on that. Mr. Jarrett.
So, Mr. Chairman, I do want to just acknowledge Mr. Valenzuela and the recorder for welcoming me into the Elections Department, and this plan could not have been prepared without their cooperation throughout the process. So, the next part of this plan will be presented to you as the Election Day and Emergency Voting Plan. It is under consideration for your approval today for us to serve the Maricopa County voters. This plan was really prepared and drafted to answer a series of questions. Those questions related to how many people will turn out to vote on Election Day? Where can I vote on Election Day? How will these polling locations be staffed? How will those polling locations be set up on Election Day? How are we going to be communicating with voters so they're aware of the information that they need to participate in this election? If there are issues that occur on Election Day, how will we respond to those issues? And then also, how much does this election cost, and potentially how are we being reimbursed for this election? All of those details are in this plan, and that's what it was designed to do, to provide that information to you and to the Maricopa County voters. So the first part of preparing a plan is, and it drives all other decisions, it's determining the potential turnout and forecasting that turnout. However, anytime that you're doing a turnout projection, you like to have lots of different data elements or data points. Well, that presents a challenge when you're talking about the presidential preference election because they occur infrequently. The last time that we had a Democrat-only presidential preference election was in 2004. That was before the permanent early voter list occurred. As Mr. Valenzuela said, 18 potential candidates are going to be on the ballot. That was before a time where there are that many candidates participating on the ballot. Also, turnout is largely driven by voter engagement and interest in whether the race is going to be competitive. Some of those factors are unknown to us at this point in time because our presidential preference election occurs Election Day on March 17th. 2 weeks prior is the Super Tuesday. So the race could be well in hand at that point in time. However, for us, when we were projecting turnout, we erred on the side of being very cautious. We used 3 different forecast models, which went back to look at the presidential preference election in 2012, which was the turnout rate. The presidential preference election in 2016, that was one model. We used a second model that looked at actual in-person voters turning out in actual elections in the 2016 presidential preference election, 2016 August primary election, and the 2018 August primary election. We also looked at those turnout rates in those elections to come up with those 3 different forecasts to provide us a wide range of potential turnout. What we're projecting is that there's going to be potentially between 337 and 429 potential voters turn out in total on election for the election. But for the Election Day, we needed to determine how many of those would be in person and how many of those would potentially be eligible or ineligible voters, because as Mr. Valenzuela was describing, we do have a robust communication strategy to inform voters who are eligible for this upcoming election. However, we know that communication plan may not always be successful, so we need to be able to prepare for those voters, those Republican voters, those independent voters. If they turn out, how will we still be able to serve them with compassion? They will be very passionate. They want to cast their vote, and we need to be able to communicate with them. So our projections are showing that potentially a range of 18 to 39,000 voters will not be eligible that will turn out on Election Day, and there will be 58,000 to 81,000 eligible voters for a total range of 67,000 to 108,000 voters. Again, these projections were made for planning purposes to ensure that we would have enough polling locations, enough poll workers to serve this election.
Mr. Chairman, just
Yes,
yeah,
Mr.
just
Gallardo.
real quickly, because we touched on it a couple times, that there's 18 potential candidates. What's the time frame in terms of the printing of the ballot? I mean, I imagine that there'll be some of our candidates that will withdraw, and you know, we can take them off the ballot that way, so there's no confusion to the voters. But what's that deadline? I mean, I'm sure it's not Super Tuesday, but when is that deadline? If a candidate wanted to withdraw and for us to remove their name on the ballot, from the ballot, when would be that drop dead date?
So we are actually, after the draw today, we will be designing that ballot. But
So the drop dead date's today.
and then we will need to, as Mr. Valenzuela stated, that we need to send these ballots out to our UOCAVA voters 45 days in advance. So there is that lead time to get those printed before that 45-day notice, which is before the Iowa caucuses. So anyone who has notified us that they will be on the ballot will, at this point in time, be on.
So, Mr. Chairman and Scott or Ray, so what is that process to inform voters if a particular candidate X is withdrawn their name? And, you know, I would hope that the voters are that tuned in what's going on, that they know that which candidates are still in the race or not. But how do we inform those voters? What's the process in letting them know, hey, candidate X is no longer,
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Gallardo, one of the unfortunate pieces is those candidates very frequently will withdraw, but they don't send the election department official notice. And without that official notice, we cannot then be communicating to voters that those candidates are no longer on the race. Now, if we have received that official notice, we can post that in the polling location and on our website. But unless we've received that notice, we have to assume that they are still actively participating in the election.
okay, thank you.
Chairman and Supervisor Gallardo, if I may add, though, the filing agent is a Secretary of State. So the 15 counties are reliant on them. So as Co-Director Jarrett indicated, if there is a withdrawal, an official withdrawal, they would file that with Secretary of State. Secretary of State does have a kind of a Be Ballot Ready kind of portal that we would direct on our website, and we would print, and if it was an official withdrawal. But by state law, we've had candidates say, I'm going to withdraw, or I have withdrawn, but without that official document, we can't remove them or post that sign.
But Mr. Chairman, though, and I'm kind of thinking back previous elections, but correct me if I'm wrong, though, if there is an official withdrawal, there is a notice posted at the 4 early voting sites or the number of polling sites that this particular candidate is not a.
Chairman, Supervisor Gallardo, absolutely. That is required in law. So, and we also put it online in our candidate, and we have a link for candidatelist.maricopa.vote, our vanity URLs that are short that will promote that out there.
Okay.
So the next portion of us planning and preparing for this election was to look at past elections. And they provide a good guide for us to overcome some of the challenges that Maricopa County has experienced before. And if we all harken back to 2016, I think we remember some of the issues that occurred during the presidential preference election. There were long lines. You see images of voters standing in line even with their early ballots. And I actually look back on that, and it's we can move and learn from those experiences. And what we've done to prepare for that for 2020 is we're more than tripling the number of polling locations. We're going from 60 polling locations that were used in 2016 to over 200 for the 2020 presidential preference. But we're not just tripling the number of locations, we're adding check-in stations. There were 2 check-in stations in each location in 2016. We will be deploying 6 check-in stations per polling location. We are also adding, as Mr. Valenzuela stated, additional poll workers. Every polling location will have 7 poll workers. One of those will be the voter registration clerk, which will be able to provide updates to name changes and address changes that occurred during the voter registration period, an option allowed for by state statute, but also a line management clerk that's going to be able to provide those voters, resolve some issues why they're standing in line or before they stand in a line. We are projecting with the numbers of check-in stations, the number of polling locations, the number of poll workers that we'll be hiring, that even at the highest peak time, voters will be waiting less than 30 minutes in line. So, and many of those locations will be much shorter. So we're very grateful to the Board of Supervisors. Back when I was appointed in June, at that same board meeting, the board approved brand new tabulation equipment for the elections department. This tabulation equipment not only will make our counting of votes be much quicker, but it also will improve security. There's not a lot of times that you can say, okay, you can accomplish both. You can have your cake and you can eat it too, but this is absolutely the case because our old equipment, while it's very sturdy, reliable equipment, it was purchased in 1996. Technology has advanced in this last 23 years. And the old equipment was, we can, even in the most optimal circumstances, can tabulate ballots at about 3,000, potentially maybe 5,000 per hour. Our new equipment can reach speeds of upwards of 8,000 ballots per hour. But it also comes with an extensive amount, a comprehensive system of audit logs. So, and it creates a digital duplication of the ballot. So we can take those original ballots. Voters are still using a hard, durable copy ballot to vote, to cast their vote on. But we can secure them immediately after they've been tabulated in the system. And then we can rely on the digital copy for comparison and other issues. The other thing that we're very excited about in this election is a brand new ballot style. Voters will be using ovals to vote instead of arrows. And that is actually easier for the voter to vote. It reduces voting errors or misreads, especially when it's due to bleed-throughs. We can offset the alignment. So this will be of significance in the 2018 general election and the 2020 general election, 2020 primary election. When we have that very long ballot, we can offset and we won't be encountering issues related to tabulation. So it just really helps expedite the tabulation process. As I mentioned before, we will be deploying 220 polling locations for the March presidential preference election. These locations will be finalized and approved by the board approximately 60 days out. We're actually out performing some inspections today. I think on ASU campus, we may be over somewhere in the West Valley, close to the Estrella Mountain campus, looking to finalize those vote centers. And part of that process is an inspection, making sure that those polling locations will serve our needs, whether they have the Wi-Fi capabilities so we can set up our check-in stations and that can connect back to our voter registration database. Also that they will be able to serve voters that have disabilities, and that we have the signage, the appropriate signage, that there are that voters can access these, that the parking is sufficient. All those types of things we run down a checklist to make sure that these locations will be able to serve all voters. We will be for this election hiring over 1,500 poll workers to serve in the polling locations. And as part of those poll workers, we need to make sure that they will be trained. I mentioned we will have brand new tabulation equipment that will come with a new accessible voting device, as well as precinct-based tabulators. We need to make sure that all those poll workers have hands-on experience with that equipment. So we'll be offering 100% hands-on in-person training. That will require 75 in-person training sessions. We went shortly after you appointed me, we did a series of roundtables with our poll workers to identify what worked in our trainings and what didn't work. And part of that is they requested role-based training. When we have line management clerks and marshals, they need specific training that may be different than the actual clerks. So we've devised those role-based trainings, and we'll be offering those in that format as well. As back to a discussion that accessible elections, we're also making our training accessible. We're partnering with the different cities around Maricopa County, and we will be offering training in some of those city facilities and town hall complexes, so our poll workers don't always have to come down to our McTech warehouse to receive training. And the last slide that I have here is just the emergency voting. So we'll be offering emergency voting for the March presidential preference election. An emergency consists of any issue that would prevent a voter from voting on election day, and it occurs from 5 p.m. on the Friday before the election until the Monday at 5 p.m. before the election. The state statute does require that we have voters sign a statement acknowledging that they are experiencing an emergency, and we will be having them sign that affidavit and statement. We are currently looking at where those emergency voting locations will be deployed or around Maricopa County, and we will transition, as Mr. Valenzuela stated, our early voting vote centers into emergency vote centers. We're currently looking to have 7 emergency vote locations. Those will be 5 locations, 1 in each Board of Supervisor district, as well as our Mesa facility and the McTech warehouse. Now I would like to turn it over to you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, with any questions you may have about the election day or emergency voting plan.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Supervisor Sellers.
Yeah, Scott, can you talk a little bit about, we think that these improvements should significantly reduce the number of provisional ballots that we have to deal with. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Sellers, that's absolutely the case. So by deploying a voter registration clerk in every voting location, that provides us real-time access to the voter registration. So if voters do turn up and they've had their name changes, if they've had, or if they've had an address change, they can update it in real time in the voting location. We do offer the 40 vote centers. So those are any voter that's registered and eligible to vote can show up at one of those voting locations, and they will not be provided a provisional ballot.
And Chairman, Supervisor Sellers, if I may add some numbers to help emphasize, before we did real-time address name update, we had over 122,000 provisionals cast in Maricopa County. That's post-election processing. 2018, due to the real-time updatability, we dropped down to 16,000. Substantial amount of ability to assist the voters in best in class, and so that's a substantial reduction, and we hope to see that with, maintain that and then focus on our independent voters that potentially come to the PPE.
And Mr. Sellers, we have one other option as well, and that comes with our new tabulation equipment. The accessible voting device does allow out-of-precinct voters to cast a ballot. That device prints a hard, durable copy of a ballot that can be inserted into the precinct-based tabulation equipment.
And the other thing I would add to that as well, too, is the way that that this team is trying to bring the numbers of provisional ballots down in the presidential preference race is by getting out and communicating to folks that this is, we're not saying whether it's good or bad or indifferent, but this is Democrat-only presidential preference election. They're the only folks who are entitled to vote. And so if we have an independent or Republican who wants to vote, they will be allowed to vote a provisional ballot. But if people know in advance not to come, then those numbers will come down as well. Other questions from my colleagues, comments? Supervisor Hickman.
Just when it comes to fiduciary responsibility to the county taxpayer, the presidential preference election is basically the county pays for it and we expect reimbursement from the state. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Hickman, that is the case. We are currently projecting the election costs somewhere around $4.4 million, and we will be seeking reimbursement from the state for that cost.
And has the state earmarked any of that money yet, or does that come up in this next budget cycle?
So, Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Hickman, they have earmarked some money for that, and it's my understanding the Secretary of State is going to be making a supplemental request to earmark additional funds. The current funding is right around $5 million, and just for Maricopa County, we're projecting a cost of 4.4, so that would not be sufficient to cover the full amount. In 2016, Maricopa County was actually awarded they could seek reimbursement for up to $4.9 million. So in that time frame, the actual election did cost about $3 million in 2016. So with more than tripling the polling locations, the number of poll workers are going from about 3 million to 4.3 or $4.4 million. It's not even nearly tripling the cost. So we are being fiduciarily responsible to the taxpayers.
And the vast majority of the planning for this, how long ago did it start? Was that way before? We had to get our ducks in order way before Republicans announced they were not participating, way before Libertarians. So, but that still didn't stop the planning process, even as far back as a year ago when this board budgeted for new equipment, brought you on board, brought in polling site training for workers, a lot of these things that we have heard prior to this election. And I still can't get it out of my mind that this presidential preference election is going to be a test for an even larger election, a statewide local election season a couple months later. So I just want everyone to be knowledgeable about that this is going to cost some money. We can't just say, well, half of the voters are not even being asked to participate, the independents. So we need to be cognizant of that fact when we talk to the legislature also. There has been some changes, but we still had to be diligent in our pursuit to pull off a great presidential preference election with in mind the primary and the general. So whatever help that we can use towards that, I will be asking for you guys, and also I don't think any of our board minds talking to people when it comes to reimbursement.
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Hickman, you're exactly right. We did start securing some of these polling locations as far back as in June and July of this past summer. These polling locations, they secure events out sometimes in a year in advance, and for us to be prepared and have them available, we had to start that early on.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments?
Mr. Chairman.
Supervisor Gallardo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank our County Recorder, Adrian Fontes, for his work and leadership in this. This is a partnership from the board and the Recorder's Office, putting politics aside and working together to make sure, as Adrian put in, and as our Supervisor Shuker always puts, this world-class election system, and I think that's what we got. I think some of you are tired of me saying that. I've always said we needed a plan, and I think that's exactly what we got. I don't believe every election, I know for a fact every election is not perfect, and I don't anticipate that we're going to ever have a perfect election. You're just not. There's too many moving parts. You have human errors. You're going to have problems. The job on our side is to make sure we're prepared to deal with those problems when they occur. That's our task. And I think with this plan and the leadership that we have with our two directors and with our county recorder, I believe we are ready for the presidential preference election. I really do. I think we were, even myself, caught flat-footed 4 years ago. I never anticipated the excitement on either side of the aisle. We saw all the presidential candidates come in 3 or 4 days prior to the election. And that was the only thing you saw on the news. And it drove up excitement. You had folks coming out of the woodwork to come out and vote and exercise their right, and that's exactly what they should do. But we just were not prepared. I believe we are prepared. I still think we need to be on our toes because I think there's still going to be excitement. We talk about 18 candidates. I hate to tell you this. I think we're going to have quite a few of those candidates still on the ballot and campaigning in Arizona just right before the election. I think you got some top 4 candidates, in my opinion, top 4 candidates that are running, but you have quite a few of the candidates that are in the race that are self-funding, and they ain't going nowhere. They're going all the way to the convention. And so I think some of these candidates are still going to be there. My biggest concern, and I think it's on everyone's mind, is making sure we relay our message out to the public that, that this is Democrats only. I think you're going to have some excited people on both sides of the aisle, independents, Republicans, Green, Libertarians, that they want to participate. But it's important for us, and this isn't our decision, this is the decision the legislature decided that they were going to make these closed primaries, and this is a closed Democratic primary. I wish it was open. I think it should be open, but that's not for me to say, it's for the legislature to say. And nonetheless, I think we got to be on our toes and continue to work together to making sure we have a clear message that all the information you provided today is relayed out to the public. But Mr. Chairman, I think we're ready to go for our primary election, and I think we got a real nice start for the upcoming primary in general in 2020. So I just want to thank you two, thank Mr. Fontes, and of course your leadership, Mr. Chairman, for making this possible today.
Thank you very much, Supervisor Gallardo. Supervisor Chukri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to echo those comments, and we were basically dealing with, and I think the premise has really always been this in recent years, with an antiquated system. And I mean that we had an agreement that dated back to the 1950s that was not in any way, shape, or form the right measurement of how we should conduct elections in 2019 or 2020. So we all had that presence of mind, and we got there. To the Recorder Fontes, Slim, I guess is his new nickname, that, we argued, we fought, we were angry with one another, but to his earlier comments, that went to the sidelines. And that's what's so beautiful about Maricopa County and our institution here, is that, yeah, we don't always agree, but we know that it's for the greater good. And that's what this is, to have the two of you sitting here going over what we just did the past 40 or so minutes is the greater good. And I don't think we can leave out our constituents either, because some are here today. They have helped us make it better, because we can't be at all hundreds of polling sites ourselves to experience what happens. So my hat's off to this body, to you, Mr. Chairman, to some of our former colleagues who saw and had the vision that we needed to get here. 2016 was a disaster, clearly. And we had to get to where we are. We had hiccups in 18, clearly, and we had to get to where we are. And I think we are finally on the right track, and I give that, really, that credit to everyone associated with this, including the Recorder, including you, Mr. Chairman, and Steve, too, for his efforts, having really being the most knowledgeable, I think, out of all of us, given his days in the Recorder's office. Way back when I think he was like 42.
Ray and I had both had. We had no grades, did we? We had no grades back
So
then.
still work ahead, and I think we still have learnings ahead of us, but I'm very, very happy, and I think we are really getting to that achievement of being best in class when it comes to our election system. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The only thing I would add is, again, I thank all of my colleagues for their work on this and for their willingness to put partisanship aside and the Recorder, and I think that's why we were able to get to the Elections Operations Agreement, which is a document that sets all this in place, but that's meaningless without the great people in the Elections Department, and that's what we've seen on display right here. I'm thrilled by what I've seen. I mean, I feel, again, the board has gotten involved because we have to understand what's going to be happening. And I feel like I do, and I feel like my colleagues do, and I feel like for those people who have watched this, have been here, they are prepared and they know that we're prepared. So that's a testament to both of you and your teams and the Recorder. So thank you for everything, and unless we have any questions, I would entertain a motion approving the Election Day and Emergency Voting Plan.
So move, Mr. Chairman.
Second.
Thank you very much for the motion and the second. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye. 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 All opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Good
Have a
job.
great day.